Hey guys, it's Dan here from PixelFix, and welcome back to my channel. And in today's episode, we're going to do something different. We'll be doing a code review. And the funny thing is, this code review will be about a project I've created myself a couple years ago when I started coding. I made a lot of rookie mistakes, and when we go through the code, I'll point them out. We will also refactor the code to make it more readable and more up to standard. Okay, so the project is basically a company review website. You've got your homepage where you can search for companies to review. You've got you can list them by category. You can filter, or if you go to the companies page, you get a whole list of companies. And if you click on a company, it'll show you how many stars they've got, what kind of reviews they've received, so on and so forth. All right, so let's head over to VS Code to look at the actual project. All right, so the first thing I normally look at when I do a code review is look at the routes file, because the routes file is basically the entry point of your application. So now if you look at this routes file, you can see I didn't really know what I was doing when I started. The routes are all over the place. It's not segregated. It's not using the standard naming conventions, etc. Okay, so because there are so many routes, the first thing we want to do is clean up the routes file. Now, in order to do that, we can segregate the routes into different files. So let's create a new folder called web. And then in our web folder, we'll create a file called companies.php. Then we'll set up our PHP file. And then what we can do is, first of all, let's take the company routes and move them into this file. Now, because we move these out into a separate file, we need to tell Laravel to basically load this file on application boot. And we can do that in our route service provider. If we scroll down into the boot method, you'll see these functions loads the actual routes files. So what we can do is we can just copy this and make another entry, and then we say our file would be in under web slash companies.php. All right, so now we can go back to the web file and remove some of the other company routes as well. All right, so what I'll do is I'll just take this whole thing because these routes sits behind some authentication. So we'll take that, go back to our companies file, and then we'll just remove the non-related ones. We'll just leave the companies in there, and we'll remove the companies from this file. And what we'll do is just clean up some of them. And we can remove these commented lines. All right, and as you can see, the routes file is already looking a lot cleaner. All right, so let's do the same for reviews. Let's create a new file called reviews, and we'll set that up. Okay, and we'll go into here, and we'll remove the reviews, place them in here, and we'll again take the ones behind middleware, place them down here, and remove the unrelated ones, and clean up these routes. And what we also need to do is just make sure we import not the route service provider. Let's import the route from the facades. All right, and we can do it the same on our companies file. And let's just clean this up a little bit more. Okay, so yeah, as you can see, it looks a little bit cleaner, but I'm not going to do all these routes in this video, otherwise it'll just take too long. But for now, we can work with the reviews and the companies. All right, so if we start looking at our reviews, you'll see the get method on the reviews. This I've mapped to a show reviews list, which is not the right method name. The right method name should be, in this case, should be index, because it lists all the reviews. So let's change that to index. Then in our review controller, we then find our method, and then we change that to index as well. Now, if you look at this index method, you can see it is all over the place. There's loads of duplicated code. There's comments that should have been removed down here as well. And yeah, it just looks a bit of a mess. So first of all, what we can do is to look at some of the code duplication down here. I think what we can do is to extract the categories into a query scope. All right, so let's head over to our model and create our category scope. We do this by creating a public function, and then we start it with the keyword scope, and in camel case we call it category. Now the first parameter that's automatically injected for us is the query, and then we want to accept our filters category as the second parameter. So what we want to check is if the filters category is not equal to all, and that same categories filter is not equal to, let's go back to the controller, is not equal to null. So we can say not equal to null. Then we want to amend the query by specifying it should be checking where the category ID equals the category. So then we want to say we want to add the where clause onto the query. All right, so if we go back to our controller, we can now basically take this whole piece of code, because the only difference between this piece of code and this piece of code is the where clause for the category. Now, because we've specified the query scope, we can basically remove this whole section and then just replace this piece or this line with the query scope, which would be with category, where our category is we pass it in. All right, so let's just clean this up a bit. All right, and now it should work exactly the same as before. Okay, so now up in our conditional, we basically don't need this check anymore. Okay, and so our next one is basically to add a query scope for our rating. So if we go back to our review model, we create another public function called scope, and we can name it rating. Again, the first parameter that's automatically injected is our query, and we will accept our rating as the second parameter. Now we need to check. So if we make sure we just go back to our controller, we can say if the rating should be bigger than 0, then it's gonna execute this code. So now if we go to the filter, we can say if our rating is bigger than 0, we want to add onto the query this piece of code. this where clause, basically. Okay, so let's go back to the controller. And now again, we can take this piece and we can replace this whole block of code. And within our where clause for the rating, we just say, okay, where the rating, please check the rating for our rating ID. Okay, so let's just clean up this commented code. And as you can see, it looks already a lot cleaner. Okay, so the next thing in this index function we can look at is this query over here. Again, we can take this whole query and go into the review model and create a public function called scope search. And same thing, we add the query as the first parameter and the search criteria as the second parameter. Okay, so now we want to specify if the search criteria exists or is not null, we want to add this to our query. All right, let's just clean this up a bit, make it a little bit nicer. Okay, now back in the review controller, we can basically remove this query function, this or where, and then we can just chain on the search and we can provide our search criteria. Okay, so the next thing we can do is basically to look at this ternary operator, which is a bit confusing. So what we want to do is we'll take the rating and then we'll check the request if it is not null. Okay, then what we want to do is if it's not null, we can then return it, or we can then return 0. Okay, so this line and this line will do exactly the same thing. This one is just easier to read and a lot cleaner. So we can remove this. And now another thing we can do is these queries over here, they don't need separate variables. So we can just remove them and basically place them in line like so. And we can use this as well in our categories and remove the spaces and clean up the code. And now this whole index method works exactly the same it used to be, but it's probably a third of the size. Alright guys, so we're not going to go through everything in this video because otherwise it'll be way too long. So the last thing I want to look at is the review create method, so which would be this one over here. So let's just separate that out so we can have a better look at it. Okay, so in this section, I'm currently not utilizing Laravel's route model binding. So let's change that. Okay, so we'll say we want the company, and then we want to use the slug as the search parameter. By default, it'll use the ID, but we want to change that to use the slug. And then let's just change our method to store. And then in our review controller, let's just search for the create review. And let's rename that to store as well. Now, in our second parameter, instead of using the slug or requesting the slug from the route, we'll basically type in our variable. And that's the way Laravel would basically inject our company for us. So we do not need to manually do the search down here. So we can go ahead and now remove that line of code. Okay, so another thing I would do in this case to refactor is obviously to remove the commented lines and then move our validation into a separate request class. All right, so let's create that class by calling PHP artisan make request, and we'll call it store review request. Okay, so now we can take our validation rules and we can do it in, we can look up our store review request and we can place our validation rules inside the rules method. We can return true because we'll not do authorization in this request. And now what we can do is we'll just clean this up. And then instead of requesting Laravel to inject the standard request class, we can now ask Laravel to inject the store review request. And now you can see our controller method is already getting a lot cleaner. Okay, so the next thing I can see that happens every time is when a review gets created, I do an operation on the slug by prepending the ID to it. So instead of doing it in this section, we could be better off using an observer for this. So let's create a new observer. And we'll call it review observer. And then we want to pass in the model, which would be review. And in our observer then, we are looking for the created method. So the created event basically will run every time this review gets created. So now we can go back. We can take these two lines, take that out, and then in our observer, we can just paste it in there. And let's import our string helper. And in this case, we're not going to use the title, the request. We're going to do it directly from the review because the review would already been saved. And this would be just review title. Okay, so now back in our controller, if we go down to our store method, we can just clean this up. And we can basically just remove this line because as you can see, it's not being used anywhere. So that's just a line that's there for no reason. Okay, so the last thing I want to do is to basically simplify the review create process by utilizing the company and the reviews relationship. And we can do this by calling the reviews relationship on the company, and then we can use the create method and then basically pass in all the required fields. So in this case, we would need to pass in the user ID, which would be, we can use auth helper.id. We don't need to pass in the company ID and the company name because it'll pick that up from the relationship. We can pass in our category ID, which we would get from the request. All right, so before we do that, let's actually extract the validated information from the request. Then we know we are just working with safe data. All right, so next what we want is let's just copy a couple of these. So the next one we're looking for is the location. We'll just copy and paste a lot of things. We also want the title, and we want the description, and we need need to copy one more rating. And we've done all this, so we can remove that. And as you can see, the create process or the create function has now been simplified, and it works exactly the same. That's going to be it for this video, guys. There are so many more things we can do to improve the code in this project, but unfortunately, we're just not going to have enough time. I showed you some of the major rookie mistakes I made when I created this project, because I was also a junior back then. So hopefully this will help you to try and improve your code so you can avoid making the same mistakes I made back then. Thank you so much for watching, guys. I really appreciate it. And if you found this useful, please hit the subscribe button, hit the like button, and if you think there's something I could have done differently, please leave a comment below. I appreciate any and all feedback. Until the next episode, guys. Cheers.